Hey everybody, Mike from Games Play Badly. Today on session 0 we have Amos from Bläckfisk Publishing. He's the co-creator of a game called Blood Feud. And the topic gets a little heavy while we're going through it because the game warrants it, and I think you're going to love the concept. I think it's an important lesson on how games are crafted. We get into the mind of the creators and what they're attempting to accomplish. It was a conversation that could not be one-sided. So enjoy the video, watch all the way through, let it sink in and simmer. Comments are always welcome. Opinions are yours, and you can express them freely within my little universe. But either way, that interview starts now. Hi, Amos. How are you?
Hey, I'm good. How are you?
Good. I'm really glad to have you on.
I'm very happy to be here. It's always nice when people want to hear about my thoughts on my games.
Oh, absolutely. And from that standpoint, I mean, we're a little bit on a time difference because you're in Sweden.
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. So yeah, we had to. This is a 10 a.m. interview for me, and it's what, a 5 o'clock interview for you.
5 o'clock, that is correct.
Well, you know what they say, it's got to be 5 o'clock somewhere.
Exactly.
So, why don't you tell me
Yeah.
a little bit about yourself? I mean, you're with Bläckfisk Publishing, and you have a new game coming out called Blood Feud. Why don't you tell me a
Mhm.
little bit about the game and how you derive the concept?
So I would start saying, the game Blood Feud came about from a very, very simple idea to begin with, and that was Peter, my co-author, wanted to he had played a game called, I believe, I don't remember exactly, called Sagas of the Icelanders, something along those lines. And he felt like this game was great, and it did a lot of really interesting stuff about exploring gender dynamics. But I want to explore gender dynamics even more. And I'd been thinking for a very long time that I would want to contribute to discussions surrounding toxic masculinity. And the best way I can do that is doing what I do best, which is make games. So we combine these two ideas together. So and that's kind of how I ended up working together with Bläckfisk Publishing on this project, because Bläckfisk Publishing is, or Bläckfisk if you prefer that pronunciation, so some people find it easier, is actually a collection of 3 individuals. And I'm working closely together with the publishing company, because when you have a company of 3 people, and one of them is your co-author, working together with them becomes very informal, right?
Right.
So it's very much this kind of informal, happy little family thing going on. Yeah, but about the game in general, I would say it's always hard to summarize your game in a single sentence, even though I've trained to do it so many times. I mean, we do have a pitch, which is,
right,
it's a game about Vikings of pre-Christian Scandinavia and about toxic masculinity. And to expand upon that, it's specifically because we want a game that explores what does it feel like to be expected to perform and to act in a way that is toxically masculine. That's kind of the core of what we want to get at. What does that feel like? What does that look like? How can we recognize it in this universe, this little microcosm that we're playing in? And what does that tell us about our universe, the world that we live in on a day-to-day?
Yeah, I thought it was there's a playthrough video that I watched, and to be honest, I was stunned. I mean, just to kind of watch it all unfold, and the reason being is knowing that you're going into it with this idea of what is considered toxic masculinity, or what is toxic masculinity. Um, as the game sets up, you can already see it happening through the choices that people are making.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I just loved was that whole setup process really is open ended. I mean, you're all basically creating your back. All the players are creating their backstories almost collaboratively, and so it makes it even more uh, mm, shockingly apparent that there's going to be conflict, even though all these people are kind of all on the same page.
Yes, it's really been one of our big tools to kind of teach people what toxic masculinity is through the setup process. So I think you're really honing in on one of the most important parts of the game, even though it's like, oh, the setup process for the game is like an hour. Do you want to sit around just fiddling with the map for an hour? And it's like, yes, because then you can play this beautiful, fantastic experience afterwards, if you ask me in my extremely non-biased opinion.
Yeah.
So, but very much of it is setting the establishment and also creating that atmosphere within the group. Because in order to really explore these behaviors, we need to make sure that they appear in game. And the way we do that is we make sure that we create artificial hierarchies in the group. So there are a number of different steps that you take in that setup that is intended to be taken in exactly that order. And when you do them in exactly that order, you're going to, one way or another, establish those hierarchies, regardless of what the group came in with on a social level.
Right. And you know what's interesting is there are, was it three, or are there three? Well, there's four including you in
Mm.
your kind of test run of the game, or the video that I watched. And so you get to see people who may not identify as male having to play a male character and kind of getting a taste of what that toxic masculinity feels like, why it's so prevalent, and I think it
Mm.
was no. As you get into the game, there are phases, and one of the phases is escalation. And I found that to be fascinating because the way you explained it worked perfectly from the standpoint of, if someone insults you, you're not going to come back with a lesser insult. You're going to intensify or escalate that kind of verbal attack. And
Yeah.
thereby really highlighting that machismo and toxic masculinity, or the theory of what it is to be a man.
Yeah. That's really what we've been trying to capture in this like escalation mechanic, because as you said, it's literally a mechanic where the moment someone insults someone, which is the most common way it starts, but there are many ways it can start, but normally an insult, you end up in this kind of like status conflict when neither one can back down, and you can't just stay where you are. You have to escalate. It has to be worse than what came before.
Mm-hmm.
And the only other option is just completely yield, abandon everything you had at stake, and just lose out entirely.
Mm-hmm.
And it is presented in this black and white way in the game, because that is the toxically masculine viewpoint.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of this mechanic and the structure has actually been to some degree based on how we've observed teenagers in public transportation and other public places interacting with each other,
Mm-hmm.
and like seeing, okay, how do they actually behave when there's a conflict in a status. Like you always see there's always two sides. There's always this balance of how far can I push you before you back off and say, no, I don't want to go this far. This is going to go too far. I'll let you have this one.
Or until it comes to an actual conflict.
Yeah.
I think one thing that I'm maybe not I'm jumping ahead because there's so many things that kind of peel away to this game that I'm getting to the parts that were probably the most uh that rang so true with me, and kind of the way that I see the game and the way I see toxic masculinity as a whole. But one of the things that people need to understand is, you're not flipping a card saying escalation and you roll some dice. There are no dice. You're role playing this entire thing. So in the beginning of the game, you're kind of role playing to set up your backstories, and you're intertwining your own character stories together. So therefore, you're laying the groundwork for an amazing role playing experience. You have to be almost laid bare at that point to play the game. You have to create your character as unpopular as maybe some of the traits that you have to pick and things like that. And then every step of the game is really a role playing decision. and you're acting through these processes, whether it be the insult or the escalation or the gifting of someone or pledging of fealty type situation. So I mean, this is a true role playing game at its core, but it has some very very dynamic outcomes, I would say.
I mean, it's really also something, this whole how you're constantly forced to play out and act out as behaviors is one of the things we have really aimed at in the design process, because by requiring this, by requiring you to embody it, we are giving everyone else a chance to see what it actually looks like. Mm-hmm. And specifically, the way the mechanics that you touched upon works is that you don't have any game master, you don't have any dice. That has nothing to do with it. You role play, and the rest of the group is going to determine which action was that. Mm. And this is a very key moment, because when they're deciding which action it was, they are learning to detect these types of behavior in people around them. Mm-hmm. And our hope is that on some level, we'll learn to detect these behaviors even outside of the game later, mm-hmm. as like an analysis tool.
Yeah, I that was something that was obvious to me as well. As I watched the game, I found it to be very therapeutic from the standpoint of I felt like there was something to be learned through playing it. I don't want anyone, and I'm looking right at the camera because I don't want anyone to think that this is a therapy session in a bottle or anything, but it is one of those things that as you're kind of moved along in the game, you can see these behaviors develop.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're aiming at. And like this session was an excellent example of me feeling like, yeah, you know what? Our game is doing what it's supposed to do. I'm happy.
Yeah, that group was fantastic. The way they played the game, I thought was just, I mean, you helped guide them through it. And I felt that that was an important piece for everyone who was watching because we got a little bit of backstory on why things are the way they are in the game. Something you may not necessarily get from a rule book, but from the creator or one of the creators themselves saying, this is the reason why these things work the way they work.
We do have a little bit of description in the books for each of the moves that kind of broadly tries to explain this, because like it is a complicated topic to approach in a game, right? Mm-hmm. How do I play this particular type of social problem in a civilization I wasn't even part of, right? Because we're talking a couple of like 1,000 years ago.
Right.
What were people like then? What were their norms? What would they expect a man to be, right? So we do have to include a little bit about that, but it's not like 1 or 2 sentences, and then we just tell you what the mechanics are.
Right.
The rest is the group's interpretation of what these mechanics mean, and the fact that we have 7 things that you can do that affects your status as a man.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and
that means that already, that list of 7 says a lot about what a man is supposed to be.
Right, and the status of being a man in your game is honor.
Yeah.
So the person with the most honorable, or the most honor, is the most manly.
Generally speaking, yeah. Again, tying it to in that culture, honor was extremely important, and it's more in terms of honor was more closely tied to family than it tends to be in our age, even though it still is very closely tied to family. Like masculinity is often very closely tied to family. Like in our day, if you're a father and your child is seen as less doing something not very manly, that reflects upon the father's masculinity as well. You know, that's an honor concept right there.
And it's so,
and you have
I was gonna say it's so funny because you're talking about this being so far removed, at least time wise, but as you start talking about these concepts, they still exist today.
Yeah. And I mean, we have been a little bit more interested in exploring deeply the ones that do exist today. There's some things that existed back then that we would have liked to be able to fit into the game, but you can only fit so much into one game of the size. For example, there's a lot of interesting, like the whole scalding tradition of how a man is supposed to be a poet. That was a very big deal back then. Being a poet and being good with words, being good with rhymes was extremely manly, and today it's often not, except in like maybe some parts of society, you know. And that's just something we didn't have time to get into.
Yeah.
Because it also wasn't necessarily very toxic, so we couldn't really focus on it.
Yeah, I get it.
So there's always this. There's always this more you want to do, but just like some things have really changed since then. But there's a lot of these things that are very much the same.
Yeah, I agree. So now your Kickstarter is launching this week.
Yes, that is correct. It's launching in 3 days now, the 18th.
Okay, so yeah,
that would be on Thursday.
We're on the 15th. So I'll try and make sure this video is up today or tomorrow, so that way you have it out before the Kickstarter kicks off.
That would be incredibly generous, but thank you.
Of course. I mean, I think this is a very important. It's a very important piece. I mean, it looks like it'd be a lot of fun to play from the standpoint of if you're a role player, this is like your meat and potatoes. This is really what you want. So so with the Kickstarter, what are you trying to accomplish? What are you funding?
So pretty much whenever it comes to a book like this, the biggest expenditure tends to be printing costs and artwork. So we want to cover printing costs so that the company, in fact, doesn't have to pay a bunch of money straight out of their own pockets, basically. Like that's really one of the big things, to be able to do these projects at all. But to a large extent, we want the ability to have more artwork in this book. Right, this little booklet book thing, and we want to make it as polished and beautiful as we can as a physical object, as opposed to just being a PDF somewhere, because that is far cheaper. That is something you can do, maybe not fully without a Kickstarter, because you still need to pay artists for all the lovely work, but it's a lot easier. But a PDF doesn't get played in the same way. When you have a physical copy, you actually want to play it. So that's what we want to create.
Yeah, I agree with you. You were using something to be able to play online, some platform there. Is that something that's going to be included in your Kickstarter, or is it going to be improved, or was it just something used for the demo?
It's something we've been used for the demo and for playtesting, and I don't think we have specific ideas for publishing that. We looked into some options, but they were very work intensive.
Yeah, I think you're gonna do just fine. I find it again, the first, and I'm gonna be honest, when the first bit when I read through this, I was like, oh geez, I don't know if I can do this, and then I actually I watched the gameplay and I was like, it's phenomenal. It is one of the things I also noticed, and I think role players will really get, is that everything is played in scenes. So every character who's playing gets their own scene that they create, and they involve certain characters in those scenes to basically act them out with them. And that's where you end up with your conflicts and resolutions and things like that. The game consists of 3 acts. So after everyone's done their scene, then they go into another act and they continue on. And basically, by the end of the 3rd act, whoever has the most honor is the winner. That's correct? Yes.
I mean, that is a very common interpretation. We actually haven't put anything in the rules as to how you actually win the game.
Yeah.
And that's a little bit intentional, in fact, because it's very interesting to discuss what does winning mean in terms of a role-playing game, and why do we feel like this is the kind of game we can win.
Right.
And it's also the whole question: did you really win by having the most honor, or did you just hurt people? Or did you just not have to do anything? You just stayed on top and was on top all the time, and everyone else had to do all the hurting people? Because that is also a possible outcome.
Yeah, you bring up a very good point.
There's a lot of discussion to be had about that.
It was kind of interesting because as I was saying that, I was like, does the person with the most honor actually win? Because they've probably been the most terrible out of everyone to get there. I did not get a chance to get to the end of it's I think it's like a 4-hour video, but I didn't. I wanted to make sure I covered the setup and everything through there, and you guys have gotten through kind of your first act, or your first act. It was wonderful though. I thought, I mean, and from the standpoint of replayability, tons of it's there. I think it challenges people in the way that they think, but it's also very entertaining to watch. If you have good role players around the table, it can be insane what they create. I mean, all of a sudden someone's cheating on somebody else with somebody's wife and they have an illegitimate child. And I mean, all this stuff they're building on the fly together.
And a lot of it is building from the groundwork that you laid down during the setup, which is giving you just, okay, these are the tools we have. You're just going to keep using the same tools. And that's going to make each and every single of the tools feel more valuable every time you reuse it. And actually, I think an important point to touch about when we're talking about this game is at the very end, once you reach the point where you know who had the most honor at the end, the story has been told so far, and this is where we're going to close it for now. That is where the game actually goes into a pretty almost fully therapeutic mode. Because as we mentioned, like, people are acting out these behaviors, right? That causes a feeling in both of you as a player who's acting out and you as a player who's on the other side of this table, right? And these artificial hierarchies we created in the setup, it would be very irresponsible for us as game designers to create those intentionally and not deal with them at the end. So at the very end, you sit down and you go through a structured debrief where you start by discussing a question of what did we like about the game, focus on positives in a way where there is no one who's in charge. Everyone gets to say exactly the same amount. And we're focusing not on the scary bits, we're focusing on the happy bits. And the intention of this is we want to make those hierarchies go away. So that once we have lessened them, then we can actually begin discussing the meat and bones of what's actually going on here. So then we start asking questions like, did you see toxic masculinity in these people? Why do you think they acted that way? Did you see parallels between what the world looks like today? What do you feel also happens today? And very often you get a lot of discussions that, depending on the group, sometimes it's very therapeutic, sometimes it's very exploratory and trying to understand. But I often feel like this last part of the game actually is a very crucial component to it, because that's where we take this experience and we make sure that we turn it into learning.
I completely agree. I that was one of the things that I did not. I don't know if you did that at the end of that video. I would imagine you did. And I may just
I
have to
think
get
it
to
was
the
like
end
the
of it.
last half an hour.
Yeah, I would love to hear what people said, because I think that is the ultimate goal. You're having some fun. You're getting to role play. But at the end of it, there are consequences. I mean, people, even though, I mean, you and I have played games before, when you're role playing and your character dies, or let's say you have a small child, that child dies. I mean, those are real emotions that you're feeling.
Oh yeah.
And to be able to take that and turn that into a therapeutic / teaching moment, I think is incredibly powerful.
It's something we realized pretty early on when deciding to design this game, that this game is going to be pretty heavy. So it's like, especially when you read the book, and like, especially if you go in to read the first sections, it's like, we have had people who have, after going through the first step of the setup where we're setting all our boundaries and expectations, then been like, nah, not for me, because it can be quite heavy. But now that knowing that, we also knew that we had to make sure there was space to take care of those feelings at the end. And that is really what we've done to take care of that. And this is actually something we learned from the LARPing community in the Nordic LARP scene, where they're infamous for focusing on trauma and negative emotions. And there's even this entire concept of type 2 fun, where LARPers will go to conventions specifically because they want to cry their heart out in character. And they call it type 2 fun. And it's all about creating that strong emotional experience where the emotional experience of the character also bleeds through to you when experiencing that. And they are excellent at taking care of their emotions after a LARP. they know exactly how to, at the end of everything, restore order to what is a normally like fairly reasonable point, making sure everyone's taken care of, making sure that it doesn't go too far.
Right.
So we've tried to learn from this community and put some of that in a role-playing game, because we realized this is a game that's going to need it at some point.
Speaking about how heavy the game can be, very early on in the setup, you basically have green, a red, and a yellow. It's basically a traffic signal. And so you go around the table and you set boundaries as to what people are not comfortable with in the game. So that way those topics aren't broached. And if at any point during the game something is brought up that somebody is uncomfortable with, they can throw up a red signal, or if you're getting close to the line, they can throw up a yellow signal, just to make sure that the role playing doesn't get too intense where it starts to alienate players.
Exactly. And that's something we stress very much. Like that's the first step, right? We're going through what is the good point of this game? What is the safety mechanic they're going to be using? And we do recommend a few specific ones. The ones you described as the one we used in the session. There are other ways of doing it. But you should have something. And then we go to explicitly talk about these boundaries, because you have to. And oftentimes talking about the boundaries is actually much more scary than playing the game, because you have to be so vulnerable about, for example, if you have a phobia, you have to own up and fess up to the fact that, oh no, spiders terrify me, for example.
Right.
Or whatever it is. It could be something that other people find completely silly, but you have a phobia for it, and you think it might appear in the game.
Right.
You first need to try and like create an environment where you can share this. So like that is like almost the scariest part of the game for many people, I think.
Yeah. That is.
And often you end up with like talking about all of these really difficult topics that you don't want, and then you go and actually play the game. In comparison to that conversation, it's a breeze.
You're right. Well, I think it's this is so well constructed that
Thank you.
That through the admission of you not wanting, like, you can say I don't want to see any meat, or I don't want to hear about anyone eating meat in this, and that's fine to say that, but then you have to back it up and you have to break it down. Why? Well, I'm a vegan. I don't believe in that. I think it's animal cruelty, but through this process of breaking down those fears, it's almost like a session zero. You're setting the table for trust.
It is. It literally is a session zero baked into a single session game. That is a very good way of putting it.
Yeah, I mean, Amos, I'm stunned. I think it's such a well thought out concept, and I think that people will get there's a lot of fun to come out of it. I think that debrief aspect of it, once it's all said and done, and you've yelled at your fellow players and maybe slept with their wives and all this other stuff, that debrief is going to be a big deal.
I've honestly had players who, after playing it, one of my standard as a game designer, even if it's a role-playing game or whatever kind of game I'm making, one of my standard questions, if I'm asking for quick feedback, is always, what was your favorite part and what was your least favorite part? Because it forces people to be specific. And the favorite part very often for this game was the debrief, which sounds funny in a way, but it also kind of shows that the game is doing what it's supposed to. Because that's what people get to sit down and talk about the experience and learn, and that was moving to them.
Yeah, and I think that admission on its face is the most important part, because if someone's willing to say, yes, let's sit down and talk about all those hard things that we had to do and the feelings that I had about them, then I think your game is a success.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, wow, I normally wear a funny hat, when I interview people, but this felt like such a serious moment. I didn't want to do that, because again, it is dealing with serious topics. It looks like it's insanely fun to play. I don't want people to think that this is, a therapy session in a box or anything like that. It's fun to play, but at the end of it, once you kind of deconstruct it, there are lessons to be learned.
Yeah. And one of the things that tends to end up happening is while people are playing out these scenes, there tends to be a lot of laughter happening. very often it's laughter of, I can't believe that this is so absurd.
Mm-hmm. Right.
These situations are so absurd. The behavior of these people is so absurd. Because when you look at it from like the whole board perspective, you see all of these people. You have a relationship map, but they're all mapped out there. In character, your characters acting the way they feel they have to. But when you as a player zoom in and see all of it, it's just absurd. It's like, why is this one guy sleeping with everybody's wife, and then later on turns out to be the father of both of the two people who are feuding against each other?
Yeah, right. It gets very convoluted.
It's absurd.
Yeah.
It's absurd.
Yeah.
But this is, and so it's like in the midst of all this, like dealing with often pretty heavy themes, you do end up looking at this and going like, what the fuck are these people doing?
Oh, right. Exactly.
Apologies if
no, don't
for
worry
the
about
language,
it.
but yeah.
You can fucking swear in here if you have to.
Duly noted.
Yeah, I just Amos, I just got again, not to beat a dead horse, but I think it's just brilliant. How do you think that this game would be used for younger adults? I mean, do you see this more as a mature game for adults, or do you see it being a game that younger people can play? I mean, do you have an age range on this?
It does include sex, so that does limit it to some extent.
Right.
Right. So if you're going to play it with younger people, you need to think about how you want to approach these people talking about sex, if that comes into play.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So that immediately sets an age limit, and I'll let whoever's involved in that discussion set that age limit, because different cultures have different limits here.
Very.
I do think that younger people stand a lot to benefit from this game if it's done in a good way.
Mm-hmm. Through your playtest, have you ever had legitimate anger at the table with because of this type of masculinity being challenged? Is there anyone who's ever just kind of like, you can tell it's raw emotion is them coming through?
Yeah. Like we've been mostly playtesting this in Sweden, so the emotion, the actual expression of the reaction is probably going to be quite subdued compared to many other cultures. But I specifically remember this one man who was very, very, very upset and couldn't quite phrase why, that a woman character was allowed to have a last word in a discussion during the scene. He wanted his male character to get the last word. And the scene was that he was playing a character who was talking to another character, and they were trying to brag, and he was bragging, like trying to be manly by saying that his half-sister was hot. And the woman, who was the mother of the half-sister and this guy, picks up a pail of, basically ice water, walks up and over to him, dumps it on top of his head, and just leaves the scene.
And once a woman leaves the scene ends
immediately.
Yeah.
Unless you want to be a complete creep and chase after or stop her from leaving, because those are the only options if you want to force the scene to continue.
Yeah, that's a distinction that I think we need to touch on. As you create a scene, let's say I was going to create a scene, I'm making up my story kind of as I go along, but I'm involving whatever players. I don't have to involve everyone, but there has to be at least one female NPC with me during that time. Otherwise, the scene ends.
Exactly.
So if at some point in time the men piss off the women and the women leave the scene ends without them having any say-so whatsoever, or you having any say-so as a player. All of a sudden, all that storyline is done and you're moving on.
Yeah. Even if you're in the middle of having this really complicated fight between like 2 or 3 people trying to pick sides and like all this honor on the table, if the women just leave and no longer care about your fighting, all of that goes into the bag.
Yeah.
Just send it all away. It doesn't matter anymore.
Right.
The women said you are not important enough.
Right. And it's interesting that the way that you empower women in this is it's empowerment, and it's also there's also kind of a harsher tale here, but
Yeah.
Women can basically do anything. They can insult, they can slap, they can do whatever, and it doesn't. There's no consequence for them.
Yeah.
But the way that you explained it was it's because women didn't affect honor. Women weren't worthy of honor. Women weren't seen as a force. And so while the gameplay can be interesting, it is a societal mirror that we're showing on how women were treated, and in some cases still are treated in society.
Mm. I mean, it's been a very interesting balance there. It's really been feeling like walking on a tightrope,
Mhm.
right? Because the fear we had when designing the mechanics surrounding women is we have to show toxic masculinity. We have to show the consequence of toxic masculinity, but we don't want to make a game that women in general as a group will not stomach to play.
Right.
That would be very untactful.
Mhm.
Like, in my opinion, that's not a game I want to make.
Right.
So we had to think of where, and a large part of that we decided early on probably is going to be about agency. Who's allowed to take action when and where? Who's allowed to do what? But at the same time, a lot of the problems with toxic masculinity is how it takes away the agency of women,
Mhm.
and how the agency of women is just waved away. They are seen as not important.
Mhm.
So we had to take away women's agency, yet still find ways to give the player playing the woman enough agency to be playing the game in a satisfying way.
Right.
And that was difficult. And we did that through having women. Like, it kind of came about from this idea that we want to focus on how men behave when women are present,
Mm-hmm.
which is like, you could kind of call it a little bit more of the peacocking type of behavior, which is like the moment you put women nearby a group of men, the group of men are going to start behaving very differently.
Mm-hmm.
It's just what happens. And you can refer to this as peacocking, the men needing to really prove that they are manly in front of, like, to the women in front of the other men,
Right.
not only to the other men. And this allows us, like, this kind of precarious little power imbalance situation where the women can actually judge the men, proved to be sort of key for us in maintaining the balance between taking away a woman's agency in order to show the problem of toxic masculinity and still providing agency for the player who's playing the woman.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot to unpack, but I think it's I think it's definitely worth people. I mean, if you're curious about this, I'll throw a link to the playthrough video that I watched, and I think it's a very good. It's beautifully crafted from the standpoint of you're kind of holding hands, guiding people through the process. And therefore you understand why the mechanics are the way they are, and it's wonderfully done. I think it opened my eyes to what the game was. I wasn't sure exactly what it was, and I thought it was great.
I'm very happy to hear that.
No.
It's always nice to hear that you're doing something right, you know?
Right. Yeah, I thought you handled the entire thing well. I think as a role player, I think I'd be having a great time playing it. And I think there's a lot of funny stuff that's going to happen at the table because the way people act to become masculine or have this machismo about them is often once you look at it from the outside, it's laughable, it's comedic.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
well, I have something stupid that I do with all of my guests, and it's called a speed round. So
Yeah.
I'm going to do a speed round with you.
That sounds great.
Yeah, it can be fun. Let me get my questions. Coffee or tea?
Coffee out of necessity and tea out of pleasure.
Yeah, I get it. Comedy or drama?
Oh, drama all the time.
Um, take one word and describe yourself.
That was easy. Queer. Come on.
Cats or dogs?
Cats.
Me too. We have 4 of them. Skydiving or bungee jumping?
Oh God, I have a fear of heights.
So neither. But if you had to choose one,
At least when I'm bungee jumping off a bridge, I know there's water I can land on.
yeah, I guess
I'll have to pick that one.
We'll give you that one. We'll give you that one.
Yeah.
All right, so your Kickstarter a couple days here on the 18th, and we're looking forward to it. I appreciate. It's going to be awesome. I'm looking forward to seeing everyone who gets to discover the game and gets to play it, and I can't wait to see the finished products. I know you guys are going to do awesome things, and I do appreciate you coming on and talking to me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
It's been a pleasure for me too.
Yeah. We'll talk soon, I'm sure, and have a good week and good luck with the Kickstarter.
Thank you very much.
Sure.